Look to this day, for it is life, the very light of life. In its brief course lie all the verities and realities of your existence, the bliss of growth, the glory of action, the splendor of beauty. For yesterday is but a dream, and tomorrow is only a vision. But today, well lived, makes every yesterday a dream of happiness, and every tomorrow a vision of hope. Look well, therefore, to this day.
For the chalice lighting this morning, I offer these words from Robert Kennedy. The torch still burns, and because it does, there remains for all of us a chance to light up the tomorrows and brighten the future. For me, this is the challenge that makes life worthwhile.
In our noisy, frenetic society, it's hard to find moments of silence anymore, even in church. But we will take one full minute of silence this morning. But before we do, I do leave you with these thoughts from Eleanor Roosevelt. You gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face. You are able to say to yourself, I have lived through this horror. I can take the next thing that comes along. You must do the thing you think you cannot do. Just to give you a heads up, today's sermon will be delivered in two parts, and we will collect our offering at the end of the first part. As our attention spans have decreased, I found that it's easier to follow a two-part sermon than one in whole. In a former life, I was a therapist, and one of my clients, whom I shall call Debbie, was having a hard time with the relationships in her life because she assumed off the bat that other people did not like her. As you can imagine, that led to struggles with loneliness and depression. And once Debbie shared her life story with me, it was easier to understand why she felt so unlikable. Her father had been a workaholic who practically abandoned Debbie and her mother while pursuing his career. So left alone, her mother felt lonely and depressed and had turned to alcohol to soothe her depression. Neither parent spent much time with Debbie or was emotionally available to her. As a child, Debbie thought as a child would think. She concluded from her parents' emotional neglect that they didn't like her. And if her parents didn't like her, it must be because she was not very likable. Why wouldn't she come to any other conclusion? Her parents knew her better than anyone, and from a child's vantage point, parents know everything. So Debbie took this conclusion she made in childhood with her into adulthood, which is typically what we all do. Throughout her life, Debbie met various people, some who liked her and some who didn't. Those who did not like her seemed to confirm her assumption that she was not likable. Now, you would think that meeting people who liked her, however, would invalidate her assumption. But that's not how assumptions work. Typically, we don't change our assumptions to fit the facts. We change the facts to fit our assumptions. So when Debbie encountered people who liked her, she assumed that they were merely being polite and pretending to like her, or that they just didn't know her well yet, and in time as they got to know her, they would dislike her. This is how the past colors the present, or as William Faulkner put it, the past is not dead, it's not even past. Debbie's assumptions about herself exerted power over her actions. Since she anticipated that people would not like her, she would not be very likable. She would withdraw and not engage people in much conversation. or she would even act snarky on occasions. And sure enough, both behaviors influenced others not to like her very much. In other words, Debbie was creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is something else we all typically do. She came to see me for therapy because she wanted to change. Now, there are basically two approaches to change. One way is trying harder. This approach is about change from the outside in. You change how you behave, or you change your circumstances in order to change how you are internally. This approach takes action. It doesn't just sit there, it does something. It formulates a step-by-step plan with clear goals and objectives, and then exerts willpower to reach those goals. This is the way of strategic plans. This is the way of self-help books. This is the way of Thomas Palmer. If at first you don't succeed, try again. This is the way Toad tries to grow a garden. This is the all-American way to change, and you may also recognize that it's the typical Unitarian way to change. Many people assume it's the only way. Now, Debbie had tried this approach before visiting me. She bought a book of daily affirmations, which she practiced saying to herself in front of the mirror each day. She became very intentional about smiling when talking to others, and she tried to be more positive and upbeat. Despite her best efforts, however, nothing seemed to work. Debbie could not make herself believe that other people could possibly like her. So she continued to feel lonely and down. Trying harder, however, is not the only way to change. Another way is not trying so hard. Or as W.C. Fields put it, if at first you don't succeed, try again, then quit. No use being a damn fool about it. Not trying so hard is about change from the inside out. Changing the way you perceive or think or feel in order to change how you behave. This approach is not so much about doing as being. It's about getting out of the way and trusting that seeds will grow when the conditions are right. It's about acceptance. And as Carl Rogers observed, the more thoroughly we accept ourselves, the more change seems to happen, unnoticed. Now, I have a very sophisticated way of determining which way is the better way. Here it is. When what you're doing isn't working, try something different. Since Debbie had been trying so hard to change, to no avail, it made sense to me that perhaps she shouldn't try so hard. And so in our sessions, we just sat and talked. I listened while she told me about her childhood, in particular about the hurt and loneliness she felt from her parents' neglect of her. Since they had provided for all of her material needs, she had never considered that they had been neglectful of her emotional needs. We looked at how their lack of warmth and nurture had led her to believe that they didn't like her and that she was unlikable. And for the first time, she became aware that she had chosen to believe this assumption as a child, and that she still believed it as an adult. Over time, Debbie allowed herself to believe that her therapist liked her. And more importantly, she started to experience herself as a likable person. As she grew to appreciate herself over time, she began to give others the benefit of the doubt. She was less guarded around others, and others didn't feel put off by her anymore. She became more comfortable with the idea of people liking her, and with the feeling of being liked, a feeling she had rarely let herself believe before. In time, she began to make friends, and Debbie changed. She changed by not trying so hard to change. One way to understand what happened to Debbie is to see that she had previously not allowed herself to experience her life as it was happening. Her assumption that she was unlikable was like a wall between herself and the experience that others could and did like her. She was stuck in living in her assumption about life instead of living in her experiences of life. When she began to trust and embrace her experience, she began to change. Change always happens when we immerse ourselves in the experiences of our lives, because life is like a river, dynamic, flowing, always moving. In fact, the word experience comes from the Latin root per, which means forward or through. Sometimes the river of life takes a straight path. Sometimes it takes unexpected twists and turns. The river of life is sometimes like turbulent rapids, and sometimes a slow, meandering stream. Now, personally, I prefer the slow, meandering streams to the turbulent rapids, but sometimes life doesn't give us a choice. But whichever is the case, life is always moving. And if we get into the flow of our experience, we too will move. Change happens through experience. But sometimes we don't immerse ourselves in our experience. We may skim along the surface of our lives by keeping ourselves so busy, so distracted by so much endless activity, that we never allow ourselves to be quiet and alone with ourselves. You can't get to know yourself unless you spend some time with yourself. I don't know about you, but it makes me feel really important when I open my calendar and see it filled with appointments. But when it's too full, that's not living. That's skimming along the surface of life. You can't think deeply or feel deeply when you're frantically on the run. When I was a psychologist of an outpatient counseling center, I used to drive one day a week to one of our satellite centers 1 hour away. When I first started making those trips, I would whine and complain about the time I was losing on the road. But then I realized that my time on the road was one of the few times in my week when I could be quiet and alone. In the beginning, I felt uncomfortable because I wasn't sure what to do with myself. But eventually, I realized I didn't have to do anything, just be. In time, I actually look forward to these mini retreats from the busyness of my life. Or we may separate ourselves from our experience, like Debbie was doing, by putting a wall of expectations and assumptions between ourselves and our experience. I remember driving a carload of kids to North Carolina, to the mountains, for a summer trip. One of them had never seen the mountains. And so as we rounded the curve and caught our first vista of the mountains, she exclaimed, "Wow, awesome, look at that. That's beautiful. I've never seen anything like that." I thought her reaction was adorable. And then we came to the next vista. "Wow, awesome, look at that. That's beautiful. I've never seen anything like that." It was really nice that she was enjoying the splendor of nature. And then the next vista, and the same intense reaction, and the next one, and the next one. After a while, her excitement became annoying. I caught myself thinking, yeah, if you've seen one mountain, you've seen them all. Now, here were two people viewing the very same scene in two different ways. She was opening herself up to her experience of the mountain's majesty, while I was closing myself off from my experience with my prejudice. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt. I was assuming there was nothing interesting to behold, and so I lost my interest. I assumed there was nothing to be gained from the experience, and so I separated myself from my experience. I was living in my assumption, not in my experience. And as a result, she was being changed, and I wasn't. Our preconceptions and prejudices, our judgments and expectations were all formed in the past, based on past experience. When we impose them on our present experience, they cut us off from the present flow of life, and we remain stagnant. Our preconceptions and assumptions interrupt the flow. It's not supposed to be like this. It's too warm, cold, salty, bright, dark, cheap, or old. I'm not strong, clever, wise, nice, diligent, or happy enough. But life doesn't fit our molds. And if we hold ourselves back and wait for life to meet our expectations, we never fully live. We don't change when we don't immerse ourselves in our lives. Sometimes we skim along the surface of our lives. Sometimes we separate ourselves from our lives with our assumptions. And sometimes we step out of the river of life and observe it from the riverbank. This is the intellectual approach to life. Not immersing in the flow of life, but reflecting on life from a safe distance. Examining, analyzing, questioning, investigating, dissecting, contemplating, pontificating on life. You may recognize this as the Unitarian way. It's living in your head, but not in your life. It's being cut off from the neck down, from your body, your feelings, your intuition, your imagination, your relationships. It's understanding everything, but being passionately committed to nothing. It's flesh and blood turned computer. And computers don't change their program without input. When you remove yourself from the stream of life and observe it from the riverbank, never getting your feet muddy or your body wet, you don't change. We invite change in our life when we practice what we were taught to do as children before crossing the street. Stop, look, and listen. It means paying attention to your experience, being fully present in the here and now as life happens. Much of the time, we're here in body only, but our minds are somewhere else. We hear, but we don't listen. We look, but we don't see. A character in the movie Postcards from the Edge wrote a card that said, "Having a wonderful time, wish I was here." At various times in my life, I have been overweight. Not obese, but unhealthily overweight. And at various times, I've taken the try harder approach to lose weight. I've forced myself to eat only certain foods in certain portions, and by sheer willpower, have occasionally lost weight, only to gain it back and then some. In recent years, however, I've tried to pay more attention to my body and to my experience of hunger. Now, I know this doesn't sound radical, but for me it's a radical approach because I was taught as a kid to eat everything on my plate. And for some reason I didn't understand then and still don't understand now, my eating everything on my plate prevented hunger in China. And it must have worked because I understand China has eliminated hunger now. But when you're taught to eat everything on your plate, you learn to focus on your plate and ignore your own experience of eating. So what I try to do now, not always successfully, is that I try to slow down and relish my experience of the meal. I try to take the time to notice the taste and texture of the food in my mouth, and to pay attention to my bodily sensation of satiation. When I do pay attention to my experience of eating, I find that I tend to eat smaller portions. And I find this fascinating. I tend to find that I want to eat healthier foods. In this way, without trying so hard, I've been able to keep my weight down. We invite change when we pay attention to our experience. Many people, and I suspect most people, go to church to feel comfortable and complacent, to be assured of what has always been will always be, to be saved, by which one has arrived at one's final destination. We religious liberals come to our religious community to be challenged to stretch and grow, not to save our souls, but to grow a soul, to be transformed, and to transform our world, to embark on a lifetime adventure of exploration and discovery, a journey which never ends. We religious liberals believe in and are dedicated to change. Sometimes trying harder leads to change, but sometimes our plans and actions can interfere with change. Sometimes our plans and actions can intrude upon the natural flow of our experience. When we immerse ourselves in the experiences of our lives, even unpleasant, painful experiences, perhaps primarily unpleasant, painful experiences, we will change. Because life is like a river, dynamic, flowing, always moving. This approach to change is not about trying to control the flow of life. It's going with the flow, with your eyes and your mind and your heart wide open. It's not so much about doing as being. It's about acceptance. It's letting life be your teacher. And for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, the lessons never end. Amen. Our benediction is the words of T.S. Eliot. We shall not cease from exploration, and in the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time.